Welcome to the Transforming Lives panel, the podcast where inspiration and transformation converge. Each week, we come together to explore the depths of personal growth and life-changing experiences. Come along with us as we deep dive into personal stories. Through intimate conversations, our guests and panel reveal the pivotal moments that have defined their paths, shown their strengths, and formed their passions. We are so happy you are here, and we welcome you to our circle where empathy and empowerment are always at the forefront.
So I'll fix it.
Yeah, so you should probably have us both as like, well, say this, let's say as.
Nice to see you.
Hi, Sherman. It's great to see you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're logging in from. Welcome to another episode of the Transforming Lives panel podcast. I'm one of the hosts, Charmin, and Mitzi is here with us. Also, we have a special guest today, and our guest is Rita Nakashima Brock, and she's a senior Vice President for Moral Injury Programs at Volunteers of America. An award-winning author, Dr. Brock was a professor for 18 years before becoming the director at the Bumpton Institute at Radcliffe College in 1997. After she served on a team to effect the Radcliffe-Harvard merger in 1999, she became director of the fellowship program at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. From 2001 to 2002, she was a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School Center for Values in Public Life. And from 2002 to 2012, she was a visiting scholar at the Starr-King School for the Ministry of the Graduate Theology Union in Berkeley, California. She is the co-author of Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, and has been educating the public about moral injury since 2010. From 2012 to 2017, she directed the Soul Repair Center at Wright Divinity School at Texas Christian University, which she co-founded with Chaplain Herman Kaiser Jr. In June 2020, the Shea University created an online 1-hour peer-facilitated small group program for moral distress in frontline workers, which is free and open to the public. And you can find that at www.voa.org/RES. It was built from strategies used in a Shea Center evidence-based moral injury program for military veterans. Welcome, Dr. Brock.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Is there anything missing from your bio?
No, I've lived a long time. It's the only thing I would say is that Shea Center is not a university. It's just a program of Volunteers of America. I wish we were a university, but we're not. We do run educational programs, though, that are very popular.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brock. Thank you for being here. Moral injury is a term not known by many. It is a new term. I was talking to someone today and I said, I have an exciting guest and she's going to be speaking about moral injury. And they're like, what is that? I'm like, okay, so wait for the episode to be released so you can understand what is moral injury. And for persons like my friend, Dr. Brock, what is moral injury?
Moral injury is basically your working conscience responding to experiences of harm that are deeply disturbing to you, morally disturbing. And it can be something you yourself did that you feel really awful about, or it can be something that you had to do because the circumstances of your life or your work meant you couldn't do anything else. Or it can be someone who betrayed you and did the wrong thing and you were harmed. So it's basically harm, and it's a moral response to harm. And I think when you think about it that way, you can see why one of the first groups they studied it with was military veterans. And partly because they discovered in some research that a veteran of war, of combat, who had to kill in combat, those veterans had double the death by suicide rates of other veterans. And veterans in general have higher death by suicide rates than the civilian population. So you can see why might be obvious that if you're a moral human being, even when you're authorized to do it and have to do it, killing could be hard, be really difficult on your conscience. And a lot of people want to slot moral injury into the mental health area, like, oh, they just need some therapy or some counseling. And it's actually not a disorder. It's not a mental health disorder. There is no protocol or there's no formal diagnosis for it. But because it isn't a distorted relationship to reality, what happened actually is awful. And your conscience is really troubled by it. That is just a normal human experience. It is not a disorder. It is, and it really isn't fixable the way a mental health condition can be alleviated and even made to disappear. You just get better. With moral injury, what happened to you can never be forgotten. So you have to figure out how you're going to live with it. And that's what we work on, is the recovery process from the devastating impact of moral injury in people's lives. Most of us, in fact, I would claim that any moral person has had a moral conflict, when you did something wrong and you felt bad about it. And most of us have ways to fix those, that we apologize, we make amends, we do things to right the relationships that got disturbed by something we might have done or experienced from someone else. But when it can't be reversed, when you may have done harm and never saw the person again, or there are just a lot of conditions in life where you can't make it okay. And those are the situations that start to bother us. I think during the COVID pandemic, a lot of healthcare workers started to feel worse and worse because their job is to save lives, and they would do all these things that they knew how to do, and people would still die. And they really didn't hardly save anybody. Like a nurse would say, I had to intubate this person who couldn't breathe, and I went back to check on them, they'd already died. And so the accumulating impact of that, one or two of those you can usually handle, but when it's almost every patient you're treating, it can weigh on your soul so much that you start to doubt your ability or doubt your commitment to the work you're doing because it's so discouraging, or you can even start to feel like you're not a good or capable human being. And that's what moral injury is that sense that we don't know who we are anymore, or we don't know why we thought this was great work when now it's defeating us, or it can be something just so cataclysmically awful that you just really can't make sense of it. And so your ability to think morally and to handle things, what you call our core moral values, you can begin to doubt them or wonder if they're sustainable. So it's an identity crisis and a moral crisis that happens to people. And it's completely ordinary. There's nothing special about it. I think so many people during COVID actually experienced it because of the things that were going on and the things that couldn't be changed, that were just awful. If that makes any sense. I think,
of course.
It's nothing particularly new. Ancient religious traditions talk about it in their sacred texts. They just don't use the term moral injury. We have stories of people betraying other people. We have stories of people killing and feeling terrible about it. And we have these psalms that say, oh, please God, create a new heart in me because I feel so terrible. So it's not new in religious texts. It's not new in literature either. It's an ancient kind of human suffering. It's just that in the last couple of 100 years, in the world of mental health, the moral questions have been sort of sidelined. The religious and meaning and moral questions have been sort of sidelined. And so if you are talking to your therapist and you say, I don't believe in God anymore, what can I do about that? That is not a question they're trained to answer or even to help guide you through. That's something a chaplain might know something about. But in some mental health circles, feelings like guilt and shame and remorse, like you're worthless, were regarded as disorders or a problem.
So you mentioned that it's not, the same way as with a lot of mental health things where, there is sort of a treatment and you can recover from it because it's obviously it's core to somebody's person, whatever their morality is, what they think is right and wrong. And if you're forced to do something because of a particular circumstance you're in that feels wrong morally to you, how it can haunt you. So it could be, as you mentioned, it sounds like a lot of what is probably triggering PTSD for veterans is that morality of it's wrong to kill, but I had no choice. I had to kill someone or I had to injure someone or somebody who has an affair. They know it's morally wrong, but they did it. And then how do they recover? So what are the things that somebody can do to try and help themselves deal with this kind of morality issue?
Before I do answer that question, I want to back up a bit and say that PTSD and moral injury are separate problems and they often overlap. So a military veteran can have both moral injury and PTSD because the conditions of combat create both conditions. But PTSD is a mental health disorder, and there really are good treatments for it. There's stuff that's like eye movement desensitization, things they can do. They have ways of helping you process the loss of memory and other things that are symptoms of PTSD, because PTSD is when you're terrified. Your fear system is like a smoke alarm going off in your head because you're afraid you're going to die. And when that happens, your normal thinking, memory processing in your brain is completely shut down. It's not on. Your fear center has already turned that off. And so you have to, and so with PTSD, once you get out of the terrorizing conditions, that doesn't mean your fear system goes back to normal. It's still going to be activated because you were terrified. And so it does create a memory in your brain, but it's not in the normal memory place where you can think about it. It's in what's called your right brain area where it's like activated, but you can't think. It's just feeling stuff that's really hard to manage. And so you can have nightmares and flashbacks and other things and also have no memory of what happened. So it's really crazy stuff that goes on with PTSD because your fear center has malfunctioned in terms of going back to its set point. So if that part of your brain can be calmed down enough that you can begin to put a memory together, like suddenly pieces of what happened, you start to lock in. And so that starts to move over to the other left side of your brain where you can reflect on it and remember it and think about it. And often when you're in PTSD treatment and you start to get better and you get a good memory, you can then feel terrible because you remembered what happened and what happened was horrible. So that's the paradox of the two together is you might be in the VA for treatment for moral injury, for PTSD and get a lot of help or from a good therapist that can do a lot of things to help people with PTSD. So as you start to feel better, you may also start to be miserable morally. You may start to feel the guilt, the shame, the outrage at what was done to you or to someone else. Those are moral responses. They're not fear responses. And so I had a person in our program, one of our programs, who was a chaplain at a psychiatric hospital. And she designed a program that was totally counterintuitive to me when she said she was going to do it. She said, I want to create a program for moral injury for people who got better and they're about to leave the hospital. And I thought, why would you do it for people who got better, right? But she said, I've noticed as a chaplain that people who finally get better and have some sense of control over their mental illness, they start to realize how much harm they did to the people in their life, especially their families, and they start to feel terrible because they're having a moral response to what they did as a bad thing. And so she said, so I'm creating a program to help them acknowledge that that could happen and that it's okay to feel that way, because that's the good part of you that wants out, but you have to process those feelings in order to be able to find that good part of yourself again. So as to recoveries, I think it's actually really helpful to be in a small group with other people who are there to also process, because they're not there to judge you, fix you, or evaluate you, or have an opinion about your experience. They're just there to try to get better and help you get better. And so our 1 hour, we have this 1 hour program online. It's free. Anybody can use it. And it's run by it's peer facilitated, which means the people who co-facilitate these small groups are trained to the facilitation tasks, but they're not in there as professionals to evaluate or judge anybody. They're there because they've had an experience of moral injury themselves and they understand what it's like to go through it. And so their job is just to help you create a safe enough group where everybody can share. And one of the best first steps with moral injury is to break the isolation that people are often in because they feel so terrible they think they're the only person that feels like that. And so they're isolated. And to be in a group where not only do other people understand it, they empathize with how you feel, but they might even find your experience helpful to them. That's a real gift to someone who's really struggling with life meaning and identity and all the horrible feelings that come from having experienced harm.
So you mentioned some group therapy and talking, and
it's not really therapy. Nobody's going to say anything about it. What it is it's a chance to experience being deeply heard, to share your experience with people who will hear you and not judge you or think about what they just empathize. And at the end of everybody's turn, anybody who wants to share something profound can share it. And then when each person shares, there's just silence. There's just receiving it, validating and receiving it. And then after everybody shares, then sometimes people will reflect and say some things to each other. But nobody's there to fix anybody because it can't be fixed. But somehow sharing it lightens the load of it. But Charmin, you helped direct the program for veterans. So you saw this effect of how it works. It's a much longer program for veterans, but this space of just open listening to people, what it really can do for others. Because Charmin was the director of our New York program for 2 years. And we saw miracles.
Yes.
We weren't in the groups. I was the project director. Charmin was the administrator of the program who recruited all the people and organized everything. I just sort of flew in to watch it happen because we had a grant and I had to write a report. So we saw the veterans at meals and around on their breaks and stuff, but we weren't inside the group. So we don't actually know what happened. We know what was supposed to happen because there was a plan and the facilitators were implementing that plan. But what we saw were the miracles. We saw people at the beginning of the day and at the end of a hard processing day be like really like utterly transformed. it was shocking to me how quickly people could change if they were just given a chance to unload things they might have been carrying for decades. And people carry, because it's moral judgments, you can stuff them down or try not to think about them or drink or work too hard so you don't have to think about them. But when you get a chance, then there's such a lifting of the soul in the person, just such a lifting of their spirit that you can actually see it.
So is there any method other than talking in a group like that? Because some people might not have access to a group. It sounds like there's not that many of these types of groups out there and available. It's relatively new. So for somebody who doesn't have access, what other things could they do to help?
They could write about it, keep a journal. That had a friend of mine who was a colonel and an interrogator in Iraq started to experience deep moral injury, and he wrote a book called God Is Not Here about what it was like to do what he was doing. And he wrote that book while he was on active duty in Iraq because he was struggling so much with the torture and the interrogation stuff. And he thinks it saved his life that he was able to do that, to write about it. Now, not everybody's going to publish a book about their experience, but he actually done a doctorate on programs to help veterans with writing to recover from moral injuries. So that's one thing you can do. You can also do visual arts and things that express the feelings that you're carrying. And what happens when you do that is then it's like if you tell somebody, you write it down, you make a mask, you sculpture, an artwork, maybe even a dance. I knew a veteran who wrote plays about his experience. That when you put it outside yourself, you've been carrying it deeply inside yourself. When you put it outside yourself, then you can examine it, and that's when the processing can begin. And you can do that alone in writing in other ways, or you can do it in a group. I think it actually happens faster in a group. We use writing exercises even in the groups themselves. So we actually teach people how to use writing to process. But the value of the group is that you get other points of view on your experience. You get somebody that says, yeah, it was really horrible what happened to you. I'm glad you came out of it alive. Or you get those kinds of statements from people, and it can change how you feel about what happened. And it isn't that you can erase what happened, but you can rethink what happened in ways that aren't so self-judgmental and so painful.
Outside of the military context, what are some common triggers or situations that might lead to moral injury in our everyday life?
Oh my gosh. There is poverty. You think about people who have to make choices about whether to buy medicine for a sick child or pay the rent. And neither choice feels good. You might make your family homeless. You might have your child die. That's a terrible dilemma. And there are a lot of life conditions that put people in those situations where they don't have a good choice to make. So you try to find maybe the lesser evil. But it can be really difficult. I think what's happening right now on colleges and universities around all the protests, again, it's like there's so many layers of morality in that. There's the moral judgment about Israel, the moral judgments about Hamas, moral judgments about what's continuing to go on, moral judgments about how the university are treating the students by bringing in police and all. So there's a whole lot of stuff in that boiler that's happening right now on college. I think it's 65 campuses that are having demonstrations where the students, I think, are feeling abused by their universities. And because, I remember reading a story of a student who they sent out this message to the students who are protesting saying you're interfering with students who need to go to their classes and take their finals and need to go to work and to their dorms. And she said, well, in Gaza, people can't even find food to eat. And the contrast between what they were protesting that was happening to Palestinians and what the university was saying, the harm they were doing, was so different that they were just contemptuous of that kind of messaging. And then the poor university people are trying to figure out their job is to keep the institution going. And then, and so what to do. And I think there's no, in those situations, there are choices that are less harmful, but there's still going to be probably harm that happens. I know there's been a lot of stuff around University of California, because it's a state university system and believes in free speech. They have not asked the students to leave or remove them. What they've done is use their security to keep the different protest groups, because they're not all agreeing with each other, separated so they don't hurt each other. And they're letting them have their say and do whatever they need to do. And then there are other universities that have not only used their own security, but local police forces to arrest everybody. And Columbia just suspended all the students, so they're no longer allowed to be on campus, so they can remove them. So that is a really complicated thing that's happening. I went through the 60s in protests against the Vietnam War, so I have some sympathy with what's going on right now on those campuses, but that's one situation. I think another one that's sadly become too ordinary is school shootings. Think about the parents who had a school shooting at their school, and now their kids are going back to that school. How traumatizing it is for the whole family. And one of the interesting books that is about school shootings called The Violence Project was a group of people who studied all the school shootings for the details, and they even interviewed students who've been involved and families. It's a very thorough examination of school shootings, and they recommended that schools not do active shooter drills with the kids because the children learn to be afraid of school. Especially little kids. They do it in preschool even, and little kids can't tell the difference between a simulation and the real thing. So you may start socializing the children to be anxious about going to school because this might happen. On top of which, 87% of the shooters attended those schools. So they just know, you're just teaching the shooters where people are hiding. So they said you shouldn't do active shooter drills except with the teachers. The teachers need the information, but you don't need to terrorize the kids because it's not effective and it's not helpful. But that was something that never occurred. I mean, I didn't think that through either, and I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, that makes so much sense. The other thing they said was teach your children to be nice to the loner kids who don't have friends. And that was like, okay, that also made a lot of sense. Because, in school, the weird kids and the unhappy kids, everybody kind of leaves them alone. And they're often the ones who have difficult family situations and may wind up being the ones who shoot the school up. So that's another situation where the way we handle things can sometimes make them worse. With all good intentions, it can make things worse. So it isn't even that somebody's trying to make things worse. Those are just two. And now, of course, there's been so many mass shootings in movie theaters and shopping malls and neighborhoods and things, and that it's increasing a sense of for a lot of people of anxiousness and not feeling safe. So
it is one of the reasons I'm glad to be Canadian.
Yeah, and of course the assault rifles and all of that are also part of the American culture that are really horrible. The Tennessee, I think it has just passed a law that's going to allow teachers who get trained to carry a handgun to school. But of course, the shooters are having AR AR-15 assault rifles. A handgun is pretty useless against an assault rifle. So their idea is more weapons is going to make people safer, which I think is a kind of faulty thinking.
What about in other situations that might be sort of more common? So I mean, because that sort of morality thing, I remember, sadly, with somebody I knew, they were boating and there was a boating accident, and the parent saved one child but wasn't able to save the other child, right? So it was one of those, you can't chase two rabbits, right? So you grab one, but then the guilt for that.
Yes,
right?
that I didn't. Yeah. No, that is really common. I actually, this is an interesting thing. There's an international organization called the Hyacinth Association, the flower hyacinth. And a military chaplain, I know, retired, he's not in the military anymore, a veteran, who's an Episcopal priest, is in that association, and asked me if I would speak to them about moral injury. And it's an association of people who have, in an accident, killed someone. So car accident, or as you say, a boating accident, or just ordinary kinds of things that happen to people that wind up killing people. You may have decided your family's going to go on a mountain hike, and then somebody falls off a cliff and dies. Right? It's things like that can really disturb people.
And you're saying, so then the best things that somebody can do in a situation like that is find some kind of a group to be talking to, or maybe a chaplain or a rabbi or someone to speak with, to be journaling, writing, doing art things to help process through the emotions they're feeling.
Pay attention to the negative feelings. Don't run from them. Write about them. Don't run from them. So I talked to a man once who, he and his wife were both ministers, and he said, and he was also a professional educator, so he'd been like head of schools for a state. And when I did a talk that he was at, and he came up to me and he said, I realized from listening to you that my wife, and our son died 2 years ago, our adult son. And I realized that my wife and I have a different relationship to his death. He said, because he grew up a brittle diabetic, and he would have nighttime seizures. And my wife somehow had some kind of intuitive radar, because a number of times she woke up in the middle of the night and went to his room, and he was having a seizure, and he saved his life. She saved his life. And so he managed to graduate from high school, and then he went to college, and he became a professional adult, and he was doing really great. And he came to visit one weekend, to visit us. And my wife had a business trip she had to go on. And so he asked her not to go. And she said, oh, honey, it'll be all right. I'll be back before you leave, and I'll see you when I get back. And then that night he died of a seizure. And he said, I think my wife feels guilty or something. He said, we go to grief counseling. We've been in grief groups. I think I've processed, I've accepted that he died, and I feel sad, but my wife feels differently about it. She's really bothered in some way. She can't let go. He said, and I just realized she has a different relationship to the death. And I said, I think your intuitions are correct. She's probably carrying a lot of moral injury. That she didn't listen to him. He asked her to stay. She said, oh, it'll be all right. And then it wasn't all right. And so I said, do you know if your wife has written a letter of apology to your son? And he said, a letter of apology? I don't think so. I said, don't tell her to do it. But if she wants to talk about the death again and brings it up, ask her to maybe think about writing a letter of apology to your son. Because I think that's what she needs to do, is apologize to him. And I said, and, we don't know, he wouldn't get it. And he smiled and he said, "Of course he would. We know he's in heaven. We believe that he is in heaven and he'll get the letter." I said, "Yeah, I think he will." So the simple acts like that. And I've proposed that several times to somebody who said to me, I really betrayed or disappointed somebody who loved me and I feel terrible about it and they died. I said, write them a letter. Tell them what you want to tell them. And we don't know, they don't get the letters. I have no idea whether they do or not. I do believe there's something beyond death. I don't know what it is. But whether or not they actually receive the letters, the writing of the letter matters a lot. To put those feelings on paper and explain them and apologize. That is a really important way to externalize how you're feeling. Not just support groups or talking to somebody else, but talking to the person you harmed. Yeah.
You have dropped so many great nuggets, but there is one thing that I'm always asked whenever moral injury is being discussed is, can one have moral injury without trauma?
Yes.
Or do they go together?
No. You may not be traumatized by the harm. Or in the case I know of he's probably in his 80s now, of a B-52 pilot in the Air Force who served from 1959 to 1963. I met him in his 70s, and he had read my book, Soul Repair, about recovering from moral injury after war. And he'd read the book and he wanted to talk to me about it. And he pointed to the book and got tears in his eyes and he said, "This is me. This is me." And I said, "Tell me how it's you." And he said, "Well, I served in the Air Force from 1959 to 1963, just 4 years." And he said, "And I was a B-52 pilot, which was a pretty elite corps in the Air Force." And he said, after my service, I didn't think about it for 40 years. I played a lot of golf. I made a lot of money. And he said, and then I got sick and I thought I was going to die a couple of years ago. And I didn't die, but what came back was all that stuff that happened to me in the Air Force. And I said, and he was clearly really suffering. And I said, "What happened to you in the Air Force?" He said, "Well, every morning I got up for 4 years and I put on my Air Force uniform and I said yes to my duty. And my duty, if I was called upon to do it, was to fly my B-52 fully loaded with 27,000 pounds of nuclear material and drop a bomb on Russia that would begin and end a war in 15 minutes. And we were taught to fly at 80,000 feet if we survived the blast, and to fly until our B-52 was out of fuel. And it takes 500 miles to glide a B-52 to the ground, but you can land it without fuel. And we would be landing in some place like Saudi Arabia, and we would not know if we had a family or a country to go home to when we landed. And he said, "I can't figure out how, as a married 23-year-old father of 2 children, that I said yes to doing that."
Mm.
He didn't have trauma. There was no fear in it. I'm sure it was fearful at the time when he did it. But what I figured out was that he served during the Cuban Missile Crisis when we were this close to nuclear war. We were one step away from nuclear war. We were at defense condition 2 because of the missiles that Khrushchev was sending to Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so they put the entire B-52 fleet into the air fully loaded and fueled for a month during that Cuban Missile Crisis because they didn't want Russia's missiles to be able to take the planes out on the ground. So they put the whole fleet in the air for a month. So he sat in his B-52 and landed to refuel and sleep. And otherwise, he was in the air in his plane waiting for the order to go to Russia and drop a nuclear bomb.
Wow.
And you think about the intensity of that for 30 days. But he didn't have to do it, and he retired honorably and had a very successful career and made a lot of money and played a lot of golf. And then it hit him when he got so sick he was nearly dying. And his thinking brain couldn't keep a lid anymore on what that trauma had been for him in 1963. So, and I don't think it was exactly trauma. Nothing really happened to him. He was just imagining things.
So this reporter was studying executions, and she found a doctor who had retired from the prison system. He was in his 70s, but he was a doctor who had attended the executions. He had, the Supreme Court stopped executions for a long time and then they restarted. So he didn't have to do them for a long time. But he was the prison doctor. He was the first black person to graduate from medical school in South Carolina, and he got a job as a prison doctor. So he was a community doctor with his community and also a prison doctor. And when the executions restarted, they have to have a doctor present to call the death. And so he became, because he was the prison doctor, he became the doctor who did the executions. So his father was a minister and his brother was in the state legislature, and his entire family, including him, all objected to the death penalty and thought it was immoral and wrong. So this reporter asked this man, then why did you do the executions? And he said, because it's the law, I can't change that. He said, and these are my patients. I am their doctor. And so it's on me to make sure they get the best medical care they can get, and 80% of them are black. And he said, and I don't trust another doctor to make sure their death is merciful, and that is something I can do by being there, is to try to get them the most merciful death possible. And he said, and I want my compassionate face to be the last thing they see before they die. So he was not traumatized by the executions. He hated them. He thought they were wrong, but he really wanted to do his compassionate duty to his patients. So his Hippocratic oath, his sense of being their doctor, was what for him was the most important value in that process. But that didn't make him feel good about having to do those executions. Yeah, and he never talked about it. The news story this reporter wrote about him was the first time his family or anybody who knew him knew he was doing those executions. He carried that weight all by himself for years. Such an interesting conversation, and obviously one that hasn't occurred for, millennia, and now, is finally getting some acknowledgement and talk, and I think that, we've just touched the surface here, but there's so much more, and you can see how many situations could be affecting people. Could you tell us a bit more about your book and how people can get in touch with you if they want to find out about this? My email is rbrock@voa.org, so rblack@voa.org. That's V, not B. So V is in Victor. voa.org. That's my email. My book is called Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War. So it's focused on military veterans, but there are lots of new books out now on moral injury in a lot of populations. There's one called If I Betray These Words by Wendy Dean and Simon Talbot. If I Betray These Words is about moral injury in medical doctors and how managed care and all these things that private healthcare companies require of doctors is ruining their ability to deliver the best care they were taught to give. They start to feel like they're bad doctors. And suicide, again, the death by suicide rates in doctors is very high. And there was just recently an article, I forgot now where, by a woman named Mona Massoud, who's a psychiatrist, and at the beginning of COVID, she got 200 doctors to help her create a hotline so that doctors who were self-talk to somebody to process what they were feeling, and it was all totally confidential and anonymous because doctors, if they're understood to be seeking mental health help or support, can and they get a diagnosis, they can lose their license or their medical insurance. So she created this anonymous line, and by the end, after 2 years of COVID, they went from having 200 volunteer operators to over 800. So the call-ins just were, and she said almost every time somebody called, they would say, "Does anybody have to know I'm making this call?" So that's how tightly confined doctors can be in terms of seeking help. It's like a stigma to seek help. And that's true for first responders. There's lots of professions where if you need support and help, you're a weak link, or you may see yourself as a weak link. And then there are other situations where, like parents or people who might feel all alone and not have anybody they know how to reach out to. I think one of the hardest moral challenges is to be the mother of a newborn. There's so much responsibility and so little help and support. So yeah, there's lots of life conditions that are high stakes, very high stakes, where somebody's life is in your hands, life or death, that are quite ordinary. Parenting is like that. Being a law enforcement officer is like that. Nowadays, being a teacher is sort of starting to feel that way. So there's lots of, and then driving a car can put you in that kind of situation. So, that people feel badly about those things, I think is a sign of their goodness. If you didn't, there's probably something wrong with your conscience. But that doesn't mean that it's easy. Moral suffering is easy to deal with. because the things we love are the things we want to be good for. And if we feel like we're not good anymore, it affects all the things we love. Thank you so much for sharing this really important conversation and giving our listeners more insight on this. And I'm sure even though your book is targeted specifically for veterans, there's a lot of it that can be interpolated and applies to other situations as well. So I'm definitely going to take a look at that because it's, I want to find out more about this because I can see so many situations where it's a factor. Yeah, and we have it at our website, which is voa.org/moral injury. A whole bunch of resources, videos, and articles and books and things that people can sort of plow through and see something that might appeal to them. There's little short videos like 10, 20 minutes that you can watch that do definitions of moral injury and things like that. So there's plenty of material now out there, and we try to stay on top of it. We update our resources list every week because there's stuff coming out all the time. And if you just want one good article that just covers the territory really well, in 2022, I think it's the September issue of Scientific American, a reporter wrote an article called The Epidemic of Moral Injury in America. Her name is, it's hard to spell, it's Svoboda, Svoboda, Elizabeth Svoboda, but it's an excellent, it covers a lot of areas of society that were experiencing moral injury in 2022. Well, Dr. Brock, we will have you back because we have just touched the surface of moral injury, and I still have a lot of questions, and I'm sure Mitzi would have additional questions, and our listeners would have questions. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining the Transforming Lives panel podcast. and we will see you at the next episode. Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Transforming Lives Panel Podcast. We hope that you received some nuggets of wisdom and seeds to plant along your journey of transformation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, we encourage you to let us know and to share us with those that matter in your life. If you would like to connect with anyone from the panel or our guest speaker, you can find all of the ways to connect in our show notes. We have so much gratitude for you, and we are so thankful to be a part of your day. Until next time, take great care.